Would you like to increase your instructional time and reduce the amount of time you spend on discipline? Do you ever find yourself reacting to student misbehavior rather than proactively addressing it? Student discipline has the potential to take up a lot of any teacher's time and can harm the environment in a classroom, particularly if teachers are not fair or consistent with their students. Students are more likely to follow classroom rules when they feel as though they have a voice in classrooms. In a 2013-14 survey administered to almost 90,000 Tennessee middle and high school students, less than half reported that they felt as though they had a voice in the disciplinary process. This included students having a chance to tell their side of the story or having an opportunity to learn from their mistakes. In addition, only about half of the students who responded agreed that school rules and consequences were applied equally between all students. What are some strategies that you can use to improve student behavior and be more consistent in how you help kids monitor their own behavior? This module will give you some strategies you can implement in your classroom to reach these very outcomes. Student-centered discipline is the first learning module in the Social and Personal Competency series. If you haven't already, you can review the Introduction to Social and Personal Competency module to learn more about the goal and purpose of the series. Each of the 10 modules in this series has been developed around one of the 10 teaching practices that promote social and personal competencies, as described in the Tennessee Toolkit, Incorporating Social and Personal Competencies into Classroom Instruction and Educator Effectiveness, a toolkit for Tennessee teachers and administrators. Student-centered disciplinary practices are built on the idea that students are able to regulate their own behavior when they are provided the necessary tools, resources, and skills. To do this, you can help students develop the skills to manage themselves. You can implement practices that help prevent misbehavior from occurring and provide students opportunities to correct their own behavior. The aim is to keep students engaged in learning rather than using exclusionary disciplinary practices that remove students from the learning environment. As such, student-centered discipline suggests that disciplinary practices are a learning process rather than a punitive process. The goal of this module is to provide you with knowledge, tools, and resources that will help you implement student-centered disciplinary practices that support student engagement and learning. Be sure to download the handouts that accompany this module so you can use them as you work through it. Currently, most exclusionary disciplinary practices, such as suspensions and removal from classrooms, do not occur because of violence or serious misconduct. Rather, they occur because of nonviolent infractions, including disrespectful behavior, dress code violations, and disruptions to the classroom. Unfortunately, students who get suspended are more likely to drop out of school or become alienated in school, regardless of the type of infractions that resulted in their suspension. However, when schools use more positive practices to discipline, students are more likely to engage in the classroom, reduce negative behaviors, improve behavior, and do better in class. Through this module, you'll learn how the development of social and emotional skills relates to student-centered discipline practices. You'll also learn practices you can implement in your own classroom that will keep students in schools. You'll finish up by developing action steps for implementing student-centered disciplinary practices in your classroom. Social and emotional skills are the foundation of student-centered discipline. In other words, when students are more aware of themselves and others, manage their own behavior and their interactions with others, and make responsible decisions, they are more capable of behaving in the classroom setting. Because social and emotional skills are so connected to your implementation of student-centered disciplinary practices, students are more likely to apply these skills when you use student-centered discipline. For example, students are more apt to buy into classroom rules and procedures, exhibit positive behaviors, and manage themselves when handling the daily stressors of school, while at the same time making good decisions. Student-centered discipline is reflected within components of the Tennessee Educator Acceleration Model, sometimes referred to as team. For example, student-centered discipline can be seen with the expectations component, given that with student-centered discipline, students are regulating their own behavior to follow through with set expectations. Similarly, it aligns with the managing student behavior and respectful culture components of the Team General Educator rubric. This module will help you learn how to use student-centered discipline in a way that is consistent with the significantly above expectations category within the team rubric. Before you get started, take a few minutes to reflect on how student-centered the disciplinary practices are in your own classroom. How much say do students have in your disciplinary process? How do your disciplinary practices impact their academic work? How do they influence how students behave and manage themselves in the classroom? If it is helpful, reflect on your use of student-centered discipline practices in a recent class, one that you can easily remember. Otherwise, try to think more holistically about your use of student-centered disciplinary practices during a typical day. You can refer to Handout 1, Student-Centered Discipline Self-Assessment, to reflect on how you implement these practices in your classroom. Now that you've reflected on your own use of student-centered discipline, take a deeper look at student-centered discipline in action. Select one of the short videos based on whether you're interested in viewing an elementary or secondary classroom, or perhaps both. As you watch the video, pay close attention to how the teacher proactively supports students to manage their own behavior. You'll find some reflection questions in Handout 2, See It in Action Reflections, that you might ask yourself as you watch. In the second half of this module, we will focus on what student-centered disciplinary practices are and potential ways to enact them in your classroom. Student-centered disciplinary practices refer to those sets of practices that you can implement in the classroom or school that help students take responsibility for their own behavior and to learn to manage themselves without you having to guide their behavior. According to George Baer, a leading expert in self-discipline, there are 3 distinct but overlapping components of classroom discipline that support all students. These 3 components include developing self-discipline, preventing problem behaviors, and correcting problem behaviors. Although distinct, the practices that support each of the 3 components work together to enhance students' ability to manage themselves. It is important to note that preventing problems or correcting problem behaviors does not mean you're helping students develop self-discipline. Rather, self-discipline involves helping students manage themselves and understanding the reasons to demonstrate positive behaviors. A key feature of student-centered discipline is the creation of an environment that distributes power evenly between teachers and the students. To do this, your disciplinary approach can't be too authoritarian, where you have all the power. Nor can your disciplinary approach be too passive, in which you attempt to be your students' friends and let your students have primary control of the classroom. When you use student-centered discipline, there is a balance of power and respect among you and your students. A balanced approach avoids using extrinsic rewards and punishments to maintain control and order, and invites students to be active participants in the management of the classroom. In those instances when you need to discipline, because there may be times you will need to discipline students, a student-centered approach to discipline maintains the student's dignity and self-worth. This module will show you how. Before getting into specific student-centered disciplinary practices, there are some general principles of student-centered discipline to review. Be clear, concise, and consistent. When providing instructions and expectations, whether for specified behaviors, a procedure, or an assignment, use as few words as you can. Students can only process so many directions at one time. Get to the point in as few directions as possible. In addition, be consistent in those rules and expectations. Focus on the behavior, not the student. If a student does misbehave or deviate from expectations, Focus on correcting the behavior the student exhibited, not the student. For example, avoid saying something like, "Brandon, you're such a bad kid," but rather say, "Brandon, when you talk out of turn, your classmates can't hear instructions." Involve students in making and enforcing rules. When you develop the rules and when you enforce the rules, involve the students. This helps students buy into the disciplinary system in your classroom. When students engage in the process, they're more likely to monitor themselves and each other. Align the consequences with the behaviors. Ensure that consequences are aligned with behaviors, both positive and negative. For example, if students are able to finish their group project early, reward them with some time to work on a project of their choosing. Conversely, if a student makes a mess in the room, he or she needs to help you organize the books in your room. Know who you and your students are. Remember that student behavior is generally motivated by satisfying basic human needs, such as safety, competence, or relationships. When students misbehave, it's often an attempt to satisfy one of those needs. Try to take steps to better understand your students and to determine why they are behaving the way that they are. Do not take it personally. Don't take it personally when students misbehave. Do not enact discipline when students are emotionally charged. Finally, don't try to resolve disciplinary infractions when a student is emotionally charged. Wait until the student calms down prior to solving the problem or setting consequences. You may need to provide a safe space for the student to calm down. There are many types of practices that teachers can use to support a student-centered disciplinary approach. This module highlights 5 of these approaches. The descriptions provided in this module are only meant to be an overview of each of these practices. You may want to dig deeper into any one of these approaches by following some of the links to resources, programs, and practices found in Handout 3, Reflection and Additional Information. The 5 approaches you'll explore in this module are teaching self-control, self-discipline, advisory periods, restorative practices, and correcting misbehavior through self-discipline. It is important to note that these practices can work in combination with other school-wide approaches to discipline, such as positive behavioral interventions and supports, or PBIS. The first student-centered disciplinary practice is about supporting students' development of self-control. Self-control is one's ability to stop automatic responses to social cues. To develop self-control, students can use strategies to stop these automatic responses and control their emotions, cognition, and behavior. Students can exhibit self-control with minor tasks, such as waiting in line or paying attention, as well as with more intensive experiences, such as bullying, a friend moving away, or getting a bad grade. Some principles that will help you support students' development of self-control include: maintain an orderly, predictable learning environment. When students are in a well-organized classroom and no set expectations, they're more likely to exhibit self-control because they'll be well rehearsed at meeting the expectations of the classroom. Notice student behaviors. Students are more likely to become impulsive when they become emotionally charged. It's important to help students notice their behaviors and their emotions, particularly when they become more intense. Redirect student behaviors. When students lose focus or make a minor infraction, a simple redirective would be appropriate. For example, you may want to remodel the expectations of the behavior, use nonverbal cues, or use redirecting language. Redirecting language can consist of concise, objective statements used to get students back on track. You can learn more about it in Module 2 on learning language. If students lose control in more severe ways, such as yelling, screaming, or becoming violent, you can provide students an opportunity to take a break, separate from the group, or lose a privilege. Help students problem solve. After students have calmed down or have had a chance to process the situation that led them to lose self-control, whether a small or large event, help the students identify ways to maintain their self-control. To do that, help them identify the cue that led them to lose self-control. You can also identify strategies that can help them remain calm or avoid the cue altogether. In addition, help students identify goals to improve their behavior and provide strategies for students to monitor their own behavior. If the situation is more severe, you may want to develop a behavior contract or have a problem-solving conference to address the behavior. Reflect and take action. Have students reflect on their goals and monitor their progress to determine if they're meeting their goals or if they need to modify them. If their behavior was disruptive to anyone, this may also be a time that the student apologizes and works on improving relationships with you, students, or other adults. According to discipline expert George Baer, in his book School Discipline and Self-Discipline, A Practical Guide to Promoting Pro-Social Student Behavior, self-discipline requires students to make decisions about how to behave and take responsibility for those choices. Self-discipline goes beyond self-control, however, because students make decisions in a socially and morally responsible way. The motivation for their behavior is intrinsic. They behave appropriately because they feel they ought to. It's different from extrinsic motivation, where student behavior is influenced by receiving a reward or through fear of punishment. Baer states that self-discipline will look differently as students grow older and as their cognitive abilities develop. However, all students can develop some degree of self-discipline. Baer provides 4 interrelated steps to developing self-discipline. These include: realize that social and moral issues exist. To do this, students learn to recognize that there are particular situations in which they should process what is happening and understand the situation before acting upon it. They can do this by learning how to pay attention to social cues and to read a situation. In addition, you can teach them about common problems or dilemmas that occur in the world. In other words, first help students become aware of the world around them. Discuss how one ought to behave. Students have learned how to behave in particular contexts, such as following rules and expectations in school. More aggressive or antisocial students may be more motivated by more external rewards or to avoid receiving punishment. Therefore, it's important to help aggressive and more antisocial students internalize intrinsic motivations to their behavior and provide students opportunities to learn how to take responsibility for their own behavior. Determine and analyze behavioral choices. Students generally know the multiple behavioral choices they can make. However, sometimes they still make poor decisions. There are multiple reasons why students might not behave in a responsible way. They might not think it's their responsibility, or there might be environmental factors, such as peer pressure or conflicting goals and values. Because of these multiple conflicting factors, it's important to review these behavioral choices with students to help them make more responsible decisions. Act on the decision. In the final step, Baer states that students need to have and be fluent in social and emotional skills and attitudes to make responsible decisions. For example, you may help students develop coping and resilience skills. Similarly, you may help students develop self-efficacy, believing that they can accomplish their goals. In any case, it is important to help students have the necessary skills to enact their choice. Each of the modules in this series provides information on helping students develop social and emotional skills. When you're done with this one, you may want to check out some of the others, or review the introduction module for a brief explanation of social and emotional skills. A common student-centered disciplinary practice is advisory periods or classroom meetings. The goal of advisories and classroom meetings is to create a time and space for students to meet as a group, helping them form a group identity and develop a better connection to school. There are many approaches to advisory. The approach in this module focuses on skill development, with a specific emphasis on the development of social and emotional skills. It also addresses skills to help resolve classroom, school, and community issues identified by students. In order to implement effective advisories or community meetings, you can create a safe and respectful classroom community where all students feel welcome and safe, in which all students have a chance to speak without ridicule. To do this, help students respect differences among their classmates, develop perspective-taking skills, and use respectful communication skills. For example, encourage students to compliment one another during these meetings, whether it be for a good idea, pro-social behavior, or improvement. Create a consistent structure for these meetings, in which you provide an agenda that can be co-created with students. The meeting goals are generally open-ended, and the meetings allow for multiple perspectives and viewpoints that invite all students to participate. Although it is important to have a general scope and structure for your meetings throughout the year, it's also important to focus on issues in the community that are important to students. Advisories or class meetings should focus on finding solutions to problems that are relevant to your students' lives. Address issues, interpersonal or systemic, that are occurring within the school, classroom, or the community at large. Through advisory periods or classroom meetings, it's important to give students a voice in their learning and feel as though they are capable of making a difference in the school. This gives them a sense of autonomy. It is also important to use interactive activities during advisory or class meetings. For example, you may want to brainstorm and role play how students might respond in different situations. Other examples include analyzing class or personal data, interviewing partners, forced choice on how students would respond, creating art, or individual reflection. Finally, if students develop action plans around a particular topic or set a goal for the classroom or group during the meeting, make sure to follow up on those action plans and goals. Hold students accountable for decisions that were made during these meetings, which will support students taking responsibility for their own decisions. Restorative practices center on the idea that misconduct and negative behavior should be a learning opportunity. To do this, you and your colleagues act with student input rather than acting without student input. Restorative practices assume that when misconduct occurs, it affects the victim, the offender, and the broader school or classroom community. Unlike more traditional approaches to discipline that focus on what rules have been broken, the goal of restorative practices is to repair any tensions or harm that has occurred, taking into account the needs of the victim and the offender. Restorative practices let the voices of the victim and the offender be heard, hold the offender accountable, and build relationships among members of the community. When you implement restorative practices, students are more likely to behave, act happier, and be more productive. There are both formal and informal structures in restorative practices. Formal structures include practices like restorative conferences. Informal structures can include practices such as informal discussions. Restorative conferences are meant to repair relationships and solve problems. It's not a therapy session for the victim or the offender. Conferences are meant to hold offenders accountable for their behavior. However, it's not about an authority figure determining the consequence. Rather, each participant in the conference has a voice in determining how to heal the harm. Restorative circles bring together more students than the more formal restorative conference. Restorative circles can be proactive, in which students discuss their own perspectives, or they can be reactive, in which the circle discusses an incident that affected the whole class. Therefore, circles have multiple purposes that can include relationship building, conflict resolution, and decision making. Restorative discussions are informal structures in which students bring up their own worries or concerns, discuss minor disruptions that occur in the classroom, or debrief after an incident that occurred in the classroom. Restorative discussions often use affective statements or I statements and affective questions to obtain a better understanding of how students feel or what they thought about a situation. For example, you might state, "When you talk when I am talking, I become frustrated because you are disrupting the class. Would you be willing to raise your hand when you want to speak?" Many of the practices discussed, except for restorative practices, have focused on what you can do to help students manage themselves and maintain a positive learning environment. However, there will be times when you'll need to correct student behaviors that interfere with teaching or have the potential to harm others. In these instances, it can be easy to punish students. However, stay true to student-centered disciplinary practices by helping students learn from their mistakes. George Baer, whose advice has been referenced several times earlier, mentions that there are two parts to correcting behavior using self-discipline: student problem solving and adult problem solving. In both, adults and students take an active role in taking responsibility for the misbehavior. Student problem solving encourages students to explore why the problem behavior occurred. It helps them take responsibility for that behavior and recognize that their behavior influences their relationships with others. To do this, students explore what the problem behavior is and why it occurred. They should understand that there are outside forces that may have influenced their behavior, but these outside forces didn't cause their behavior. Students discuss why the behavior is actually a problem, identifying why the behavior was inappropriate outside of reasons like, because I'm not supposed to. You can help students identify ways to avoid repeating the behavior, including how they can navigate their environment so as not to blame their environment for their behavior. Similarly, you can help them choose alternatives to their behavior and evaluate the potential alternatives. After they've done this, have them develop an action plan of ways to correct their behavior. After students have identified their new behaviors, help them use self-management techniques to set goals, monitor and evaluate their goals, and reward themselves for accomplishing their goals. Because student behavior is set in context, it's also important for adults to take some responsibility for student behavior. You and your colleagues can reflect on the classroom and school structures and practices that support or hinder student behavior. For example, you may want to review the disciplinary policy of the school to ensure it reflects student-centered disciplinary practices. In addition, you can collect data from students about how they perceive the learning and disciplinary environment in the school. Implement evidence-based programs and practices that have a demonstrated impact in helping students learn pro-social skills, including self-management and responsible decision-making. Social and emotional programs that have a focus on student-centered discipline include the Ruler Approach, PAFs, Developmental Designs, Caring School Community, Raising Healthy Children, and Responsive Classrooms, among others. Information on these programs can be found in Handout 3, Reflection and Additional Information. Engage families in meaningful ways in the school and establish families as partners. You can help students successfully implement the action plans they develop to improve their own behavior. This can help to remind students about the goals they set. Model good social and emotional skills in your interactions with students and your colleagues. Thank you for participating in the Student-Centered Discipline module. We encourage you to complete Handout 3, Reflection and Additional Information, to help you reflect on the information in this module and identify ways you can use student-centered discipline in your classroom. As you consider your own plan of action, keep in mind the following helpful hints. Set a goal for yourself related to at least one of the 5 approaches introduced in this module. For example, you may want to find a model for structuring advisory periods or classroom meetings in ways that reflect the principles of student-centered discipline. Find more information. Remember, this is an introduction to the principles of student-centered discipline, so you may need to find additional information. Handout 3, Reflection and Additional Information, contains links to the social and emotional learning programs, advice on class meetings, restorative practices, and more. Involve your students. Consider ways to incorporate their ideas and suggestions to make discipline in your classroom more student-centered. This can help them become accountable, in part for the new strategies you want to try in your classroom. Consider how you might document and share your progress. You may want to collaborate with a colleague or share your experiences with your professional learning community, or members of your department. If you're viewing this information and related to better understanding the team rubric, consider how you might share your action steps with coaches, mentor teachers, administrators, or those who might observe your class. They will benefit from knowing your efforts and may be able to provide feedback on your actions. The Tennessee Department of Education developed the online module in collaboration with the Center on Great Teachers and Leaders and the Appalachia Regional Comprehensive Center, which are funded by the U.S. Department of Education. If you want to find out more information about the online modules or social and personal competencies, please contact the Office of Safe and Supportive Schools, Division of Student Support Services at the Tennessee Department of Education. Thank you again for participating in the Student-Centered Discipline online module. We encourage you to complete the online evaluation of the learning module. We also encourage you to review the other online modules that provide knowledge, tools, resources, and strategies to embed social and personal competencies within your classroom.